All right, so welcome everybody to our interview with Professor Furr. This will last probably roughly around an hour or so, give or take. We've got 12 questions for the professor, and we'll get going. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, firstly, introduce yourself, what kind of work you do, and so on.
Thank you very much. First of all, thanks to all of you in the NLC for inviting me. I consider it an honor to speak to you. Well, very briefly, I got interested in Marxism-Leninism in the 1960s when I was protesting against the war in Vietnam. I was studying comparative literature, which included Russian language. And after reading about some alleged horrors that Stalin was alleged to have committed, I decided that I would do some research. And what I found in the 1970s and the early 80s was that the books and articles that I found written by the experts, so-called experts on Soviet history, did really not contain any evidence. They were basically recycled stories from Khrushchev era Soviet sources, plus Trotsky, plus other anti-communist sources, but they didn't contain any evidence. And so my first article or two back at that period really stated that. And then when the internet came along, I put one of my articles online and was contacted by a gentleman in Russia who's been my colleague now for over 20 years, Vladimir Prof. We started to work on the Tukhachevsky trial, but along the way, I was reading documents from former Soviet archives, and many of which Vladimir instructed me on how to locate. And I discovered a few documents that contradicted what Khrushchev had to say in that famous secret speech of 1956 to the 20th Party Congress. So initially, I thought I would write a short article pointing out that, well, there are 4 or 5 statements that Khrushchev made that we can now prove are false because we have the primary source evidence from the former Soviet archives. But the fact is that the more I read, the more I realized it wasn't 4 or 5. It was going to be a great many more than that. So eventually, I realized I would have to write a full-blown study of Khrushchev's speech, and discovered that really, with one exception that I couldn't really prove one way or the other, really all of the allegations that Khrushchev made against Stalin or Lavrentiy Beria in that famous speech are false, and that most of them were deliberate lies. That is, you could prove that Khrushchev knew better in some sense. So I wrote that book, Khrushchev Lied, but I realized that this was going to be too hard to take for not only the field of Soviet studies in general, but many activists as well. I also realized, and this is very important, I think, that there had never been any evidence that Stalin committed any of these crimes. There had been claims. Khrushchev and Khrushchev-era Soviet writers, and then Gorbachev and Gorbachev-era Soviet writers, and Trotsky and Trotskyists and pro-capitalist anti-communists had made lots of charges, allegations, claims that Stalin had committed this or that or the other crime. But there was never any evidence. For example, the Moscow trials, there was never any evidence that the Moscow trials were a frame-up. Never, not in the 30s, not ever. But that was stated from different sources, different anti-communist sources, particularly from the Khrushchev-era Soviet sources, and then the Gorbachev-era Soviet sources. It was stated from so often from so many apparently different sources that everybody just sort of assumed it was true. And I, of course, had assumed it was true too. So that threw into question not just Khrushchev's speech, but really our whole framework of how to understand Soviet history during the Stalin period. And because the history of the 20th century is in so many ways affected by the Soviet history, the emergence of the Soviet Union and the Comintern and the World Communist Movement was so central to the major political events of the 20th century. In some sense, the fact that the Stalin period was so heavily falsified really means that much of the history of the 20th century in terms of world politics has to be recast, has to be rethought completely. And that, of course, is way too much for the profession of history to do. The profession of history is conservative, like most professions are, and they're just not about to undertake that. So that's the situation I find myself in today. And if you're a Marxist-Leninist, that's a situation you find yourselves in as well.
All right, very good. So for our second question, in your view, what is the significance that the USSR plays for modern day leftist movements?
Well, the significance that it plays is that it's a sort of horror story, right? That all modern day leftists should avoid anything remotely resembling the communist movement of the 20th century because it led to all these mass murders led to the leadership of a monstrous dictator like Stalin and all these mass murderers. That's on the one hand, but what the significance really is quite different from that. And on the one hand, if you take the achievements of the Soviet Union during the period where Stalin was in the leadership, let's say from the late 1920s to 1953, those achievements were monumental, and they were recognized worldwide as monumental achievements. Then if you also remove the stigma, the false charges of terrible crimes leveled against Stalin, then the picture of the Soviet history during that period of time is much more positive, and it means that we have to rethink that period again. We have to rethink the whole question of why the Soviet Union did not evolve into a communist society, which was certainly the aim of Lenin and Stalin and many millions of communists all around the world, including in the Soviet Union, but way beyond that. So we have to rethink that whole question of what, not only what great achievements the Soviet Union accomplished, but what caused it to go off the rails and not lead to a communist society.
Mm-hmm. Okay, third question. What advancements were made for the people of the USSR from 1929 to 1953? It's the most controversial period for mainstream historians. So to be clear for those listening, basically we're looking at what is, give or take, considered to be the Stalin period here.
Yes, that's right. 29 to 53, the tough period that Stalin was really in the leadership of the Soviet Union. It really had no serious challengers for that leadership. For the advancements for the people in the Soviet Union, well, collectivization ended the 1,000-year cycle of serious, devastating famines that had existed in Russia, Ukraine, and that whole area. And in fact, the 4 serious famines of the 1920s were the immediate cause of the Bolsheviks and Stalin turning to the process of collectivization in order to put an end to the medieval system of agriculture very primitive agriculture in Russia, in the Soviet Union, which would have continued to cause devastating famines every several years, and of course, which would have doomed the Soviet Union to destruction by the fascists. So this was a tremendous achievement and an absolutely essential one, and of course laid the basis for the increase in the standard of living in the Soviet Union after the Second World War, because the agriculture collectivization went hand in hand with industrialization. Industrialization meant many things, of course, building a powerful army, building a machine tool industry, building a, but also producing goods which in times of famine, because there still were famines, there were still harvest failures, the Soviets could exchange for grain when they needed to from foreign countries. So after 1932-33, the famous famine at that time, there really was never again another serious famine except for that of 1946. But there's been some good research on the famine of 1946. It was caused, as was the famine of 32-33, by natural causes, and it was Europe-wide. For example, probably 300,000 to 500,000 Germany starved to death that year. And Great Britain even asked the Soviet Union, the Cold War hadn't really descended yet, Great Britain actually asked the Soviet Union for help in feeding the British population, and of course the Soviets had to tell them that they couldn't give that help because the Soviets were suffering a famine too. So except for that famine, which was the only, and of course the tremendous destruction of the Second World War was also in large part responsible for the famine of 1946. So except for the famine of 46, there was never another serious countrywide famine in the Soviet Union or now Russia after the famine of 32-33. And that was certainly because of collectivization of agriculture. That was a tremendous feat. So was industrialization. But of course, there were many reforms in many different areas of workers' rights, in terms of subsidies for rent and for food and for necessities, vacation, free education. The situation of women was greatly improved. The racism was officially outlawed and with considerable success. There was anti-religious propaganda, which certainly had a big impact on a couple of generations of Soviet citizens. And I won't say much about it, but I think one of the tremendous gains was the international communist movement, which was a major force in organizing workers in industrial countries, such as the United States, and probably the single most significant force in anti-colonial struggles against the imperialist powers. The so-called free world, of course, are all imperialists, okay, who had no respect for the rights of the people under their boot, and certainly were not democratic any more then than they are now. So the international communist movement was a tremendous success. Think of the Spanish Civil War, right? The international brigades. You know, the greatest demonstration of proletarian internationalism, perhaps that ever existed in the world. So, so just briefly, those are some of the really world-shaking benefits and advances in the during this so-called Stalin period.
Yeah, those are all phenomenal points. I really like how you got into talking about, proletarian international nationalism and how the Soviet Union projected itself, you know,
Yes.
to be for the benefit of international laborers. I think that's something that people on the left, you know, like even today, like really quick to overlook the position that the Soviet Union really played in strengthening struggles for liberation and leftist policies around the world. And yeah, I think it's important that we put the spotlight on that. Kind of wrapping around back, I think that oftentimes people talk about the famine in 1932 and 33, the so-called Holodomor, as like a horrible intentional genocide and something terrible. So could you shed some light on this event in particular, you know, like whether it was a genocide or a natural famine, something else, and why do you think historians today view it the way that they do?
So before I get to speaking about the famine, which in some sense I spoke about very briefly in answering the previous question, let me just say this. What's important to me is, and it has been from the beginning, is to discover the truth about Soviet history. When I became interested in the history of the communist movement, the Soviet Union during the anti-war movement of the 1960s, I didn't know. I wasn't pro-Stalin. I wasn't anti-Stalin. I mean, I guess I was anti-Stalin in the sense that sort of everybody was, because, you know, that's what we were taught in school and so forth. But I mean, I really didn't know anything. And so I determined that I was not going to go out there and be an apologist for any side. I was going to try to discover the truth. And it is possible to discover the truth if you study historical method and you know how to use primary source evidence. It's possible. And for those of you who are maybe not familiar with that, you know, read some of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries. I quote them in one or two of my books because people are familiar with them. And, you know, Holmes doesn't care who committed a certain crime. He just wants to solve the crime. That's it. He wants to get to the root of things. He wants to find out the truth. And so I saw myself in that kind of role, and I still do. However, I very quickly discovered that if you dare to study an alleged crime by a crime that's alleged that Stalin committed, and you study it and you come to the conclusion that the evidence does not support it, that there is no evidence that Stalin actually committed this crime, you will be called a Stalinist. And what that means is that people will assume that you started with a preconceived idea that you were going to try to cherry pick the evidence that Stalin was not guilty and ignore the evidence that he was guilty, or something like that. And that you're not being objective, you're not interested in the truth, you're just interested in defending Stalin. Now, that is in fact not true of me, but it is true of the history profession in general, the profession of people who study and teach Soviet history. It's true of them. It is true of Trotskyists, Social Democrats, and all anti-communists, that they start from the premise that Stalin was bad, and they cherry pick their evidence, if they can find any evidence at all, and use logical fallacies and quoting from people whose statements are not evidence. And they go out of their way to try to claim that Stalin was a mass murderer. And it's gotten to the point now, long since gotten to the point, whereby you simply aren't allowed to question that. Okay, if you say, well, you know, Stalin wasn't a mass murderer. The Moscow trials, I wrote a book on this. The Moscow trials, the testimony of the Moscow trials was not compelled, not forced. The Moscow trials were not a farce. They were not a performance that was scripted by the NKVD or by Stalin's minions, that these people were guilty of at least those crimes that they confessed to. I mean, you simply can't say that, even though all the evidence points in that direction, all of it. Likewise with the so-called Holodomor. Well, no, it's interesting. The Holodomor is a phony term invented by Ukrainian nationalists who themselves were fascists to describe the 1932-33 famine, and they wanted to be able to blame that famine on the Soviets because they needed to apologize for, to try to explain away their own allegiance to Hitler and the Nazis during the war, and their tremendous atrocities committed by the Ukrainian nationalists. So they invented this concept, and of course, Holodomor was dreamed up to sound something like Holocaust, right? So they also wanted to claim that, you know, the Holocaust of the Jews is widely deplored, and no right-thinking person doubts it. But look at us poor Ukrainian nationalists. Nobody believes in the Holodomor. And it's interesting that no reputable anti-communist Western scholar agrees that there was a Holodomor. Not one, including some of the more conservative ones. But the Ukrainian nationalists don't care about that. They are interested in making a sort of leapfrogging over the academic community, going straight to the popular and semi-popular press, who are not in a position to assess the truth or falsehood of what the Ukrainian nationalists say. And they've been somewhat successful in doing that. Okay, it's common to talk to people who say, "Oh yes, the Holodomor was terrible," and of course, and that's very interesting because it shows that if you repeat the big lie over and over again from as many different angles as you can, it will stick in people's minds, regardless of the fact that there's absolutely no evidence whatever that there was any kind of deliberate starvation in the Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. Great answer. Yeah, I think it's an important point to raise to a lot of people in particular, and you did definitely touch on it quite a lot. That, you know, the consensus, even among those who are vehemently like anti-communist, anti-Stalin, there even you know, those do admit that yes, maybe, you know, the famine was not an intentional genocide. It was, you know, a natural famine with, you know, maybe even if you get some things people talking about, you know, oh well, it was a terrible mistake by the Soviets, which, you know, is not something that I subscribe to as in that being the primary cause. But even then, that's still not the same as a genocide, which is what is, you know, made out in the propaganda.
Yeah. Well, of course, people died as a result of collectivization. There's no question about that. But here's the story: if there had been no collectivization, many more people would have died.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, because there were famines every 2 or 3 or 4 years, very serious, devastating famines, and they were caused. Yes, they are caused by the fact that the climatic conditions in Russia, particularly, are not very favorable. It's quite far north. There often are severe climatic conditions that cause plant diseases, infestations of rodents, insects. It's a very short growing period, and all these kinds of problems, and that's certainly was never going to go away. So there would have been many more casualties. In fact, there had been a great many casualties during the 4 famines of the 1920s. And certainly no modern society capable of defending itself could have persisted with the medieval form of agriculture that existed at that time. So the Soviets really had no choice. Now, Bukharin and some of the other people who were pretty close to the Soviet leadership, one time Bukharin was in the Soviet leadership, said, "Oh, you know, we should take a much more gradual approach." But a glance at the history book will show you that they didn't have the time to do that. Okay? The Nazis attacked in 1941, and there are many people who thought that they might very well attack before that. So there really was, they really had no choice. I think that that that's clear, and that's what's never discussed. What's never discussed, virtually never discussed, except by one or two people. And let me just say, Mark Tauger of West Virginia University is the world authority on the famines and on Soviet agriculture, and he talks about it a little bit, but nobody else does. Nobody talks about the fact that if agriculture had not been collectivized, the casualties would have been much greater.
Question 5, again, kind of going into the specifics like this question did. How do you think, and you did touch on this in question 3, but we'll get into a bit more detail. How do you think that the Moscow trials influenced the trajectory of the USSR? In your opinion, in hindsight, what countermeasures or changes in policy, if any, could Stalin have used to mitigate the negative effects of the political purges?
The first thing to recognize, and as I said, I did a whole study of this because it is a very important question, obviously. I did a whole study of the Moscow trials. I did a whole book on it. And I did that because once you've discovered that Khrushchev lied, then the obvious question is, so A, why didn't he cite any real crimes that Stalin committed? Was it because he didn't know of any, therefore he had to lie? I mean, that's a reasonable hypothesis. And the second thing is, what else is false about Soviet history? So up until Khrushchev's speech, I would say that certainly in the world communist movement, not including the Trotskyists, of course, in the world communist movement, people believed that the Soviet government, that they believed that the Moscow trials were honest and that these defendants were guilty. Okay, that was what most people believed. Yes, the anti-communists, of course, said, oh, no, they're all frame-ups and so forth. Trotsky said, oh, no, they're all frame-ups, but they had no evidence of that. There was never any evidence that these trials were other than what they appeared to be, genuine trials with genuine confessions by genuine defendants who were guilty of at least the crimes that they confessed to. And I studied their testimony and weigh it according to the evidence that we now have from the former Soviet archives, and it's very clear. So the real question is, why didn't people understand that? And the reason people didn't understand that, well, the anti-communists and the Trotskyists, is because they didn't want it. They didn't want it to be true. They wanted these trials to be phony because they wanted to slander and attack the world communist movement. And Trotsky, of course, had it in for Stalin specifically, but in general, that's why they claimed that these trials were fake. Now, Khrushchev comes along and he declares they were all false. They didn't have any evidence that they're false. I've studied all that Khrushchev stuff. He didn't have any evidence that they were false. When it came to Gorbachev, and there was the Brezhnev period, when it came to Gorbachev, he made even stronger claims that the Moscow trials are frame-ups. Some years ago, my colleague Vladimir Bobrov in Moscow and I published an article, I think it's on my webpage, because we discovered the decree of the Soviet Supreme Court in 1988 that declared Bukharin and other defendants of the Third Moscow trial innocent. And that document was top secret in the Soviet Union at that time, and it's still top secret in Russia today. It has not been released, but we found a copy of it in the Volkogonov archive, which is, an archive of stuff that was smuggled out of the Soviet Union. Okay, the Soviet Supreme Court was lying. We wrote an article proving it. They lied. So clearly, they would not have done that if they had any evidence that these people were. These defendants were innocent. They had no evidence that they were innocent. They had to falsify the evidence that they cited. So yeah. Now you said, what could the Soviets have done to mitigate the negative effects? Well, I think they did take some steps. The transcript of the first trial was partial. It was only partly a transcript. A lot of the trial was summarized, and there were only certain quotations from it that were published. In the second trial, much more of the full transcript was published. And in the second and third trials, the prosecution cited documentation that they had to use as evidence, because that was not done in the first trial, and the Soviets, it seems, paid attention to some of the criticisms of their opponents and decided to include documentation in their in the trial transcripts, and they did. But none of this was going to convince any of the anti-communists, and it certainly wasn't going to convince Trotsky and the Trotskyists. So the real pivotal question comes down to, where did Khrushchev come from? Because if Khrushchev hadn't given that famous secret speech, if there hadn't been a Khrushchev, now, you know, that's a kind of counterfactual statement that in some sense is highly speculative, you know, but if there hadn't been a Khrushchev, the world history, the history of the world communist movement would have been very, very different. It was really Khrushchev who opened up the floodgates to accusing Stalin and the Soviet leadership of his time, and thereby all of his policies and so forth, to this avalanche of falsehoods, of lies, which passed for the truth immediately because Khrushchev was the leader of the international communist movement, and still passes for the truth for the most part. You can still find lots of scholars who quote Khrushchev era documents as evidence, even though none of it's evidence. I published that book, Khrushchev Lied, in Russian, a different title, of course, in 2008, and I published it in English in 2011, which is 10 years ago. I know, because I know enough people in the field, I know that everybody, all of the professional historians of the Soviet Union know about it. It is never cited. Not only is my book never cited, I mean, but the fact that Khrushchev lied in that speech is never cited, ever. It's like you can't say that, even though they all know it's true. So when it comes to the professional field of Soviet history, you're talking about a deeply dishonest field of study, where there is some honest research in specific narrow areas, but the framework that it's all put in is what I call the anti-Stalin paradigm, and it's really really very, very dishonest. And of course, the people who are in the field know that you can't claim, if there's some crime that Stalin's been accused of, you cannot say, no matter what evidence you have, you can't say, well, he didn't do it, we have the evidence. You just can't say that. That's taboo. Okay, it can't be done. It's not, you're not going to make a career that way. You're not going to get published. You're going to ruin yourself. So, you know, why even go there? But of course, the rest of the world doesn't know that. And the mass media don't know that. And so people end up thinking that, well, yes, I personally don't know any evidence that the Moscow trials are a frame up or that Stalin committed all these crimes. But you know, somebody must know, you know, these professors, these Yale and Harvard and all these major universities in the States and all around the world, they all claim it was a frame up. Some of them somebody must have some evidence somewhere. The fact is that there is none. There is no evidence that the Moscow trials were a frame up, and there never has been.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think that's natural, really, that this thing would come up with trying to get work published and trying to talk about these things in the historical field, because, you know, you're working under a bourgeois ideological framework. Like, obviously, your statement is contradictory to like imperialist, you know, capitalist thinking. Like, if we go and we disprove all of these lies that we've told about Joseph Stalin, that's going to legitimize this ideology that we have thus far been able to say, like, oh, that's just like what evil dictators do. So, like, obviously, that's the natural direction that things would go in. I think the next question really ties in well to that concept. So I think it's safe to say that among many historical figures, figures within, not historical figures, figures within the historical community,
Yeah.
you're considered controversial for your research, and some people would argue that you are just a blatant Stalin defensist, and you say, Stalin did nothing wrong. Obviously, that's not true. So what mistakes do you think, if any, Stalin might have made that could have been avoided and that we should learn from going forward when talking about socialism?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of dishonesty in the discussion of Soviet history of the Stalin period in general, and there's a lot of dishonesty in the so-called criticisms of me. I'm glad to have honest criticism. I get very, very little of it. I get a lot of dishonest criticism, and this quotation you put here in the question is one of them. I never said Stalin did anything wrong. That's what I said was I have researched this topic for many years. I said this back in 2012, I think, and have never found a single crime that Stalin committed. Stalin made lots of mistakes. If you talk about doing something wrong, of course, everybody makes mistakes, so Stalin made mistakes too. And that would be a very valuable discussion to have, but the people who accuse me of being a Stalinist are not interested in having that discussion. They're not interested in learning what we can learn in both a positive sense and also in a negative sense from the true history of what really happened in the Soviet Union during the Stalin period. They're interested in perpetuating the falsehoods, which they don't regard them as falsehoods, perhaps, but perpetuating the falsehoods about Stalin and the Stalin period. And the more I read and research, and the more writing and publishing I do, the truer that statement, that situation seems to me. That this is people who claim that I'm a Stalinist are basically saying, Furr is biased, he's not interested in the truth, he's not objective, and so you can ignore what he says. And in fact, none of that's true. I strive very hard to be objective. Anyone who's read any of my books will see that there is a section in each of them about the absolute need for objectivity, and how if you don't proceed with objectivity in your study from the very beginning, you will never come across the truth. And that's true in the sciences and the social sciences, and it's true in history as well. And as for being a controversial figure, what I guess, if that means anything, it means that I don't say what other historians say. The reason that I can afford to be objective and to tell the truth the way I see it, the way the evidence shows it, is because I don't make my living by participating in the profession of Soviet or Russian history. I'm not a professional historian of that period. I teach English literature. So my career, so to speak, is not dependent upon having people in the field of Soviet studies agree with me. But if I were in the field of Soviet history, Russian history, I certainly would not be able to go out and discover the truth. I would not be able to publish the materials that I publish because they simply would not be published. They would not be accepted. A quick example, a couple of years ago, I published a book on the Katyn massacre. And I discovered that essentially there's no evidence worth the name that the Soviets were guilty of killing the Polish prisoners at Katyn. And a young Soviet scholar who in retrospect didn't know any better interviewed me for a podcast, and the editor of the podcast series refused to publish it because, as he told her, everybody knows that the Soviets were guilty at Katyn, and therefore this is a closed issue. We're not going to visit. We'll be ridiculed if we say that they didn't. If we even review a book that claims the Soviets were innocent at Katyn, that would be bad for us. So we're not going to do it. So this is what you're talking about. You're talking about a deeply dishonest field. And by the way, my second or third to last book, Stalin Waiting for the Truth, is a point-by-point critique of Stalin Waiting for Hitler, volume 2 of Stephen Kotkin's projected 3-volume massive biography of Stalin. Kotkin is recognized as the top historian of the Stalin period and of Stalin himself in the entire world. He's a professor at Princeton. He's a fellow of the Hoover Institution. His book has received glowing reviews everywhere it's been reviewed. And it is a tissue of falsehoods and deliberate lies from beginning to end, and I prove it in that book. You can read it. But if Kotkin, if the leading figure, leading scholar on Stalin in the academic world, worldwide academic world, writes a book about this period, 1929 to 1941, and every allegation of crime or misdeed, or even, even sort of impoliteness on the part of Stalin, if every single one of his claims can be disproven, you have a good demonstration of how fundamentally dishonest this field of study is.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very in-depth response.
Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So in terms of the question, so the next question we have written down is what made Khrushchev era of revisionism in the betrayal of Stalin so important? But we've kind of already touched on that, I guess, in quite a lot of detail. So if it's all right with you, I'll incorporate the 7th and 8th together, if that's okay.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
Khrushchev was the leader of the international communist movement, and what he said was horrifying to communists around the world. But it was, it was like a gift to anti-communists everywhere, and so of course it was welcomed by anti-communists all over the world, including by the Trotskyists, and it became very influential as a result. There was some popular resistance. Certainly in Georgia, there were riots, and the NKVD had to be sent in. This is as a result of Khrushchev's speech. There were certainly a lot of discontent on the lower levels of the society, among the working class, peasantry, but not organized revolts. But Khrushchev's stance was popular among intellectuals who regarded it as and anti-communists, because Khrushchev started to publish people like Solzhenitsyn and others who echoed his dishonest critiques of the Stalin period, and that was defined as freedom of the press, freedom to express yourself. There was certainly more freedom for anti-communists to express themselves under Khrushchev. There was no freedom for people who disagreed with Khrushchev, who thought that he was lying. There was no freedom for them to express their opinions. Now we know that in the Soviet Union, in Russia, and this goes back to the last days of the Soviet Union too, there are many people who doubted. They didn't have the evidence, but they doubted. But the Khrushchev era and Gorbachev era allegations of massive crimes by Stalin, and now that a considerable large number of primary sources from former Soviet archives have been published, have been made available. We're now able to prove that Khrushchev and Gorbachev and their henchmen and so forth were lying. But of course, that couldn't be done during the Soviet period. Okay, nobody really had any evidence to refute what they had to say. So there was resistance. Now, of course, let me just conclude by saying that now, of course, Stalin is either the first or second most popular figure in Russian history. When Russians are asked in Russia today, various polls, Stalin is either the first or the second most popular figure. Usually the first most popular figure is some ancient figure like, one of the czars who fought against the Mongols, or something like that. And Stalin is a very popular figure among the masses of the Russian population, but he's extremely unpopular in general among the intelligentsia, who never were won to the ideals of socialism and communism.
Yeah. I think it's really important to talk about the ways that, Khrushchev really led the Soviet Union down a path towards revisionism and kind of hammered home this anti-Stalinist, de-Stalinist position in order to secure his own power base within the country. Mm-hmm. So I think it's pretty generally agreed that after Khrushchev took power, after Stalin died, the Soviet Union to move down a path of revisionism. And in hindsight, how do you think that the fall of the USSR, which really finds its roots in this Khrushchevite revisionism after Stalin died, how do you think that could have been avoided? And if so, why didn't that happen? Like, why was the USSR pushed down the route of revisionism?
Well, obviously, it could have happened somewhat differently if there had been someone other than Gorbachev had been in charge. But so maybe it could have lasted somewhat longer. Maybe you could have had a situation, somewhat like China, or I don't know, Vietnam or something, where the Communist Party remained in power, but the political system or the economic system changed very dramatically. Some of the specific way it happened depended on Gorbachev and the particular individuals that he chose to as his major advisors. If Andropov had lived, perhaps the Soviet Union could have hung on longer. Once you start promoting, what we might call right-wing nationalism or bourgeois nationalism, though, the question's got to arise, who needs the Soviet Union? If you're not going to have proletarian internationalism, then who needs the Soviet Union? And I think that's a large part of what happened. It's not like the country fell apart, but the leaders of the Communist Party, the different areas, wanted to become, heads, chiefs of their own particular areas, independent countries even. And so, unlike China, which let's say is a country where 90% of the population are Han Chinese, and only a small percentage are not of that ethnic group. Soviet Union is a multi-ethnic state. So the form in which the breakup of the Soviet Union took place, which was nationalism, basically bourgeois nationalism, was hard to avoid. And so I don't know. Even if the Soviet Union had remained in existence in name, I think the policies that Gorbachev wanted to pursue, because that's what he wanted it to remain Soviet Union. He wanted to basically become a kind of social democratic society. Could that have happened? I don't know. I doubt it, but we're crystal ball gazing at this point. The point is that the Soviet Union as a society, as it was under, or conceived to be, under Lenin and under Stalin, a society that evolved to an advanced stage of socialism and then gradually evolved into a communist society. That process ended, more or less with Stalin's death.
Nice one. So This is a bit of an interesting one, I think. This is the one I'm most looking forward to hearing out of all of them.
Yep.
What direction? You've obviously been, doing this for quite a long time now, and over the course of your career looking into the USSR, what direction have you seen the general opinion of figures like Stalin move in the past decades? And, perhaps more interestingly, if it's a difficult question to answer this one, but if you could at all, maybe give some kind of idea, how do you predict it could move in the future? So how do you think, the opinion of figures like Stalin have moved in the past decades, and how do you predict it might look going forward?
Yeah, I'm not much of a crystal ball gazer, but I would say that it's interesting to me that there's perhaps more vigorous and more determined anti-Stalinism now than there was in the past. It's hard to measure that kind of thing, but certainly since the end of the Soviet Union, in all of the Eastern European countries, the former Soviet bloc and the countries that used to be constituent parts of the Soviet Union, one of the main tools of constructing a reactionary anti-communist past history for these new right-wing states has been to exaggerate and, in fact, to invent alleged crimes of Stalin, and so that process has been carried out very, very vigorously in the former Eastern Bloc states and in the states that used to be part of the Soviet Union. So in that sense, there's much more intense anti-Stalinism now than there was, let's say, even in the waning years of the Soviet Union during the Gorbachev period. And it's completely dishonest. So what I see, well, I mean, by the way, just let me say this, one more thing. You're the Marxist Leninist, MLC is Marxist Leninist, what's the C stand for?
So
it's Marxist Literature Collective.
Yeah,
Marxist Literature. Okay, Marxist Literature. Okay, all right. Well, but insofar as you're Marxist, or insofar as you're Marxist Leninist, or anybody's a Marxist Leninist, attacks on Stalin are really attacks on you. If enough people can be convinced that Stalin was this monster and he was a Marxist Leninist, then Marxist Leninists are on the slippery slope to becoming Stalin, little Stalins on the slippery slope to mass murder, and therefore that is, if they ever become stronger, that's going to be used as a justification for nipping them in the bud, for suppressing them, for repressing them. So that anti-communism is very dangerous.
Yeah,
and it's dangerous to everybody, to all working people, but it's particularly dangerous to people who want to call themselves Marxist-Leninists. And that's the direction that I've seen anti-Stalinism developing is towards more and more of it, and it has to be more and more dishonest because there is no evidence to prop it up, and therefore the discourse not only in the mass media about Stalin, but the semi-popular press about Stalin, the press that's aimed at intellectuals, for example, but in the historical field itself, the discourse, the ferocious anti-Stalin discourse, and the falsehoods, if anything, have to be even increased. Certainly, I've seen no evidence that they're dying out. And to ask for evidence is simply taboo, okay? Because I know a couple of people in that field, and a couple of them have told me that, yes, that's true. We can't really prove any of these things, but who wants to rock the boat? I want to have my career. I want to do my specific study, and I'm certainly not going to come out and say, well, you know, the evidence against Stalin is like the emperor's new clothes. You know, it isn't really there, but people keep saying it's there, but it isn't really there. They're not going to say that, and they're not going to go there. So I don't foresee the anti-Stalinism in the profession or in the mass media or in the capitalist world, if you want, even in Russia. I don't foresee it decreasing. I am in touch with a number of people in Russia who are working on the Katyn issue, who are convinced by the evidence that the Soviets were not guilty at Katyn, and they translated my Katyn book into Russian and have done a little bit to publicize it as much as they can. But the Russian government still insists that the Soviet government was guilty of murdering the Poles at Katyn. They have absolutely no evidence. All the evidence points in the opposite direction. Read my book, you can see it. But that doesn't stop the Soviet government from claiming it. The Soviet government, of course, is tremendously anti-Stalin, anti-communist, and so they're not going to start telling the truth. Now, it's not just the Russians. Of course, we know that the United States government lies about its foreign policy and domestic policy and so forth, lies about American history as well. But I don't see, we're talking about Stalin here, I don't see any let-up in the anti-Stalin propaganda in future years. And if anything, it's going to perhaps increase. I'm awaiting volume 3 of Stephen Kotkin's projected 3-volume biography of Stalin. That's going to be very interesting. It was initially announced for November 15th, 2020. Then it was postponed to February the 1st, 2021. And now there is no specific date. I don't know why that is, but when that comes out, I look forward to studying it very carefully. It'll probably take me a couple of years. And I would be very surprised if Kotkin did not continue to lie in an outrageous manner about the last years of the Stalin period, and because that's how he's built his career, and that's what's going to perpetuate his status in the field. That's what everybody's looking for, and of course he's a fellow of the Hoover Institution, which is the premier anti-communist research institution in the world. And the Hoover Institution never publishes anything that is objective, that is not anti-communist. They're not interested in anything like that. So even to be a fellow of the Hoover Institution, if you know somebody's a fellow of the Hoover Institution, you know right away that person can have no, that person's a phony scholar, because they have no respect for the essential ingredient of objectivity, without which no scholarship is worth anything.
Yeah, I think you really like hit the nail on the head with that one. I think that probably the most important reason why we have to make it a point, or we should at least try to make it a point to talk about Stalin and try to, you know, defend him in this way is that it's also an attack on us, you know.
Yeah.
That like me personally, Marxist Leninist, I'm called Stalinist all the time, just because you know that's the ideology found, and you know,
the idea that
it's always derogatory.
The idea that anybody would actually be looking for the truth and then discover that Stalin did not commit some crime, that is taboo. Okay, if you discover, it doesn't make any difference how much evidence you have. You can pile up the evidence from now until kingdom come. If you pile up the evidence that shows that Stalin did not commit some crime of which he has been accused, you will be called a Stalinist, and therefore whoever called you that will say, well, you can dismiss his research. He's not really interested in the truth. Okay, they aren't going to look at your evidence. So that's the situation we're in with regard to the Stalin period of the Soviet Union, which of course it's a tremendously important for people on the left generally to study what really happened in the Soviet Union, as opposed to all of these lies about all the crimes that Stalin committed and so forth. It's tremendously important to study the truth, to first of all discover the truth, and then to study it so we can learn not only lessons from what the Soviets did that was correct, that was good, but also learn from the errors they made, because obviously they made errors. Stalin and like Lenin wanted to build communism, and that didn't happen. So they must have made some serious errors, not crimes, errors. And we need to know what those errors were. But as long as we're presented with a history which is a tissue of lies and fabrications and falsehoods, we can never learn what those the lessons from what the Soviets mistakes.
It's, you know, it's impossible to have a constructive, objective, you know, decent, proper discussion about Stalin and the USSR, you know, under his leadership and their role and everything. It's basically impossible to have that, you know, necessary and good conversation when we're spending most of our time just trying to debunk people who say that, you know, it was akin to like fascism and Hitler, which is absurd. And you know, you're right to point that out. It is very difficult to have the constructive, proper conversation that needs to be had when, you know, the view of Stalin currently in you know, as you point out, like mainstream bourgeois historian circles is, you know, that he was the most evil person on the planet and blah 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 whatever.
There's one let me just say one more thing about the Moscow trials. The Moscow trials transcripts are easily available. They're available cheaply in secondhand bookstores online. If you add up all the pages of the 3 Moscow trial transcripts, you're looking at, I don't know, 1,500 pages. Very few people have studied those transcripts. I have studied them. Very few people have, and you can understand why. If you've already been convinced by all the propaganda that, you know, these trials are all frame-ups, then why would you put in the effort, the time to study the transcripts, right? So therefore, they're seldom, if ever, studied. I don't mean read rapidly through. I mean, they're seldom, if ever, studied. Now, in my book, The Moscow Trials as Evidence, that's what I do. And it's very revealing. But I have never met a person who argued with me, who said, I disagree with you about the Moscow trials, who'd actually studied the transcripts, much less then tried to go out and see whether anything in those transcripts could be verified, could be checked up by independent evidence that we now have. So there's a tremendous amount of dishonesty in all of this anti-Stalin stuff, and not only by the experts in the field, but it's trickled down into the left movement too. And it's a ball and chain. It's a tremendous handicap to the socialist, communist, left movement around the world that they have bought into this enormous campaign to denigrate the history of the Soviet Union during Stalin's time and Stalin himself. I was just today reading a review that just came out of Ronald G. Sunni's book on Stalin, which only goes up to the Russian Revolution, doesn't go past that. Sunni's 80 years old, more than 80 years old. He spent his whole life studying Stalin. It's reviewed by Norman Naimark, who's a fellow at the Hoover Institution, of course, and a professor at Stanford. And, you know, Naimark says, it just came out, Naimark says, well, you know, we study this early history of Stalin's life, and we can't understand how he became such a mass murderer, such a monster, because there's nothing in his early life that seems to have pointed him in that direction. We could never have predicted that. And of course, they couldn't have predicted it because it isn't true. But Naimark perpetuates, without citing any evidence, perpetuates this view. And as for Sunni himself, a month or two ago, he had a book reviewed on the one of the mailing lists, the H-Diplo list, I think. And he says, he refers to Stalin as a brutal dictator. And I remember remarking to some friends of mine, because I've spoken about this in the past, so I better publish something about it. In fact, Stalin was not only not brutal, but he wasn't a dictator. And there's plenty of evidence that he was neither brutal nor a dictator. But you have to say Stalin was a brutal dictator. If you don't say that, then, you're outside the limits of respectability. That's it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. I think that ties in really to this question, because you brought up so many of these sources and resources that you've used to come to these conclusions. So,
Yes.
like, what resources do you think would be helpful and that we can link up besides your own work for someone who would want to unlearn all of this propaganda that's been put forward about the USSR over the years?
And I just want to say on that as well, feel free to also plug your own work, because it's great. So you can also plug your own
I
stuff.
mean, we'll definitely link your work in wherever we post this anyways. So
Sure. If you email me, I can email you. It's online somewhere. I have a list of the books that I've written. You go to my homepage and I have a list of all the books that I've written and co-authored, and also all of the articles that I've got published, and you can download them from my webpage too. I have been looking for other people who do the kind of research I do. There are a couple in Russia. There is evidently one guy, I've read a book by him in Germany, but their works are not well known. And they have not put in they're not as well documented. So I have to tell you that there is not a school of historical research on the Stalin period of which I am a member. Unfortunately, tragically maybe, so at this point, I really am the only one. And that's not good, because I'm not going to be around forever. Nobody is. And we desperately need more people doing the kind of work I do. I don't mean kind of coming to my conclusions. I mean studying the history of the Soviet Union during the Stalin period with objectivity and with the determination to use primary source evidence, a good logic and reasoning, and to avoid all the logical fallacies that you so often find in this kind of research. I don't know of anybody else who is doing this, and we desperately need more people to do it. There you have it.
Yeah, that's definitely something to look at. It's worrying, as you point out. It is worrying.
Yeah, I have a few friends who are Trotskyists, and their defense, because some of them have actually read a little bit of what I've written, not too much, because I guess it's threatening to them. I don't know, but in any case, they're nice guys, and I get along with them. But so their defense is, well, you can't believe Soviet evidence. But the primary Trotskyist historian of the last generation, and the one that's universally praised by all Trotskyists, is the late Vadim Rogovin, who died, I think, in 1999. But he wrote like 8 books on the Stalin period in Russian. Some of them have been translated into other languages. I think 2 of them are in English now. And he used nothing but Soviet era documentation.
Yeah.
So the idea that, well, Soviet evidence is not good. If the only evidence we have that Trotsky, for example, was guilty of collaboration with the Nazis, which he certainly was, because we have an enormous amount of evidence of it. If the only evidence we have of Soviet that is Soviet evidence, then we can throw it all out and ignore it. But that's not objective, of course. What's objective is if you come at it for somebody who has no preconceived ideas, and you have this person, Trotsky, whom you don't know anything about, but you take a look at the evidence, and there's this tremendous amount of evidence that he was guilty of collaborating with the Nazis, and no evidence that he wasn't, of course, except for his own denials. Of course, he's going to deny it. Then you have to say, well, unless something else comes up, unless different evidence comes up, unless something new is discovered, we have to conclude, we have to go with the evidence. Scientists, materialists go with the evidence, whether it's in physics or chemistry or biology or the social sciences and history too. You have to go with the evidence. The evidence that we have is that Trotsky collaborated big time with the Nazis, just like the Soviets charged him in the Moscow trials of doing. And we have no countervailing evidence. And therefore, that has to be our conclusion. You have to go with the evidence. But of course, Trotskyists are not objective. They're not interested in the truth. They're interested in being defensive. And therefore, not only they, but anti-communists in general say, well, Furr is a Stalinist, but I'm not a Stalinist. I'm interested in the truth. If Stalin committed some crimes, I want to know about it. In fact, I want to discover them, and I want to publish about them. I want to know if Stalin committed crimes. I want to know what other kinds of errors he made. I'm not interested in defending him. To dismiss the history of the Soviet Union during the Stalin period, something that's not worth doing, I get called a Stalinist. So you should be aware, if you start talking the truth about the Stalin period in the Soviet Union, you too will be called a Stalinist and attacked. And that's the world we're living in now. And it shows, of course, that communism is still the specter haunting Europe, except it's the specter haunting the world now, right? And the specter of Stalin is right there, continuing to haunt the bourgeoisie and the phony socialists around the world. Thank you.
Yeah. I would like to say that I greatly admire both you and your Trotskyist friends for managing to keep that friendship in place, given I imagine the strong views both of you hold.
Yes.
Fair play. Okay, so we've reached through all of the questions we've received. And we got a lot of questions coming in throughout this, which I wasn't really expecting how many coming through, but a lot came through. We can either open the floor to you now to just say what you'd like to say, or we can ask you a couple of those. It's completely up to you. Completely your call.
Is that to me?
Yes, I'm just saying. So we can either ask you, and the questions are all the new questions are all revolving around prior ones. Okay. But we can either ask you them, or we can just open the floor to you.
No, that's fine. Yeah, go ahead. I can stay on for another, little while. Sure.
Nice one. Cool. Okay, so I'll just find a couple of those now because we did get a lot.
Sure.
Okay, so it's actually quite a good question. What we didn't think of. So, question here from somebody: what does Mr. Furr think about the cult of personality which surrounded Stalin, and to what extent did Stalin support or oppose it? It's actually a good question. So yeah, have you got anything to say on that real quick?
Real quick. That's the first issue that I touch on in my very first book, Khrushchev Lied. There's a lot of evidence that Stalin did not like the cult of personality. He rejected it. If he had been the all-powerful figure that anti-communists claimed that he was, he of course could have stopped it by a wave of his hand or something, by a command. But Stalin, from what I can tell, Stalin believed in collective leadership, and that's what he said. But if you read that section of my book, Khrushchev Lied, you'll see that there's plenty of evidence that Stalin opposed the cult of personality. And after he died, apparently at the first Politburo meeting, which by now was called a Presidium, Malenkov stood up, and this is published in a book by Yuri Zhukov, who's a well-known Russian scholar of this period. Malenkov stood up and he said, well, we have to do something about this cult of personality. Comrade Stalin always told us that it was a bad thing, that it was a social democratic thing, that it was not a Marxist Leninist thing. But we never had the courage. We never had the courage to do anything about it. This is Malenkov at either the first or one of the first Presidium meetings after Stalin's death. It's in that book.
Thank you. That's well put. Thank you. Okay, so let me just find another one here. Okay, so let's have a look here. Someone asked a question regarding Tito. I'm not sure if
I know nothing about Tito.
That's absolutely fine. We can leave that be.
Sorry,
no problem.
I'm studying the Soviet Union during Stalin's period. That's all I can do.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. No worries at all.
Okay.
Yeah, it linked to the USSR, but we can leave it. It's absolutely fine.
Sure.
Okay, let's have a look here. We've got a very long question here. So we got a long question here. I'm going to try and summarize it a little bit. So we got a question basically saying the emergence of an ultimately counter-revolutionary class of bureaucrats was something that Stalin himself recognized the danger of, perhaps too late. And they mention here in the question that his intended democratic reforms to solve these unfortunately ultimately failed. So the two questions the commenter is asking from this are, one, to what extent was the emergence of this counter-revolutionary class the inevitable result of the Soviet economy and state? And secondly, what historical lessons can we learn from it?
This is partly a historical question and partly a theoretical question, and I'm not confident that I can argue the theoretical question very well. But in my opinion, okay, let's put it that way. This is not something I can prove. In my opinion, having studied the Soviet history during the Stalin period and trying to penetrate through all the obfuscation and the lies and so forth and try to get at what really went on, which I think is our task if we want to really learn from the Soviet history, do better in the future. I think that the Bolshevik concept of how to build socialism was faulty. I think that Stalin did not contravene what Lenin taught or advocated. I think Stalin basically continued it, tried to follow what he imagined Lenin's blueprint would have been. Lenin didn't really have a blueprint. Marx and Engels didn't really have a blueprint either. But Lenin had made certain remarks over the years, and Stalin certainly studied those. And he tried to do what he imagined Lenin would have done. And as far as I can tell, he did. So that suggests that there is something in Lenin's view of how to build socialism, which was never fully developed by any means. And even before that, in Marx's and Engels' view of how to build socialism as communism, that is either faulty. Well, that's faulty. Let's just say that. The document that I'm thinking about by Marx is the Critique of the Gotha program, where he talks about I think it's the first stage and the second stage of the lower stage and the higher stage of socialism. And he makes some remarks there that people in the socialist and communist movements after him seized upon to if you want, legitimate inequality, the preservation of all kinds of inequalities under socialism. And certainly that was the case in the Soviet Union. Okay, there was a tremendous and growing disparity in pay. There seemed to be little or no effort to break down the division between mental and manual labor. Let me not say none, but it was certainly insufficient. Soviet sciences and technology were largely a continuation of capitalist sciences and technology in many respects. The forces of production were organized in a capitalist manner, assembly lines, workers, foremen, so forth and so on. Arguably at the time, the theory in the 30s was, we're building socialism, which is a preliminary stage to moving towards communism. This isn't communism. And B, we're going to have to do anything necessary to industrialize quickly, to build up our armaments industry and our army, to withstand the coming onslaught from the capitalist powers. So there certainly are reasons why the Soviet Union did not break with capitalist practices in many respects. But whatever those reasons were, and however justified their actions seemed at the time, it's clear that Soviet socialism led to its own reversal. I don't think much is to be gained by bandying the term bureaucracy around, but the concept of breaking down the barrier between mental and manual labor. That's something that Lenin, of course, wanted to do, right? I mean, he talked about that, how to reorganize the workers and peasants inspectorate, right? We have to increase the number of workers in the workers and peasants inspectorate. You need to increase the number of workers in the central committee, stuff like that. But I think that's an important issue. A document that was recently published in Russia was the resolution taken on February the 8th, 1932 by the Politburo, subsequently voted by the Senate Committee, to abolish the party maximum, that is the maximum wage that party members could earn. Abolish the party maximum for certain specialists in certain areas of science and industry. As far back as the Khrushchev period, Roy Medvedev, who's not somebody who's I have much faith in, but he did note that the party maximum had been abolished. And the idea of the party maximum was that communists should set an example for everybody else and not strive to, live a fancy lifestyle, strive to uphold a kind of disciplined and even perhaps Spartan standard of living, set an example for other workers. And the basic idea of communists, that communists should, their main job was not to increase production, but to increase the recruitment of other communists, right? To build the communist movement. And I think that was lost sight of, that the good communist became the person who was most expert in production, economic success. Now, economic success is very important, but looking back on it, I think we need to reassess those kinds of decisions.
That was a really good answer. Thank you.
I think really solid. I think one of the notes that we have to take away from like Soviet history in general is just, bureaucratization is not inevitable, but the reason behind it is understandable. Like thinking of the Soviet Union in terms of like a nation that under siege because it is ideologically a threat to the rest of the world. Like it's understandable why decisions made that, would eventually lead to bureaucratism and that we have to like steer ourselves away from in future experiments. But, the thought behind them is logical and grounded the actual reality of how the world was at the time.
There's a book that's not bad by an American Trotskyist, I think it's Thomas Twiss, about Trotsky's concept of bureaucracy. I believe he's the author. He's a Trotskyist and he has the usual anti-Stalin stuff, but it's a very good, he's got an interesting question here. What did Trotsky mean by charging Stalin, saying the Soviet Union was bureaucratic, or the party was bureaucratic, or Stalin was a bureaucrat, his supporters were the bureaucrats? What do you mean by that? That turns out he didn't have any fixed meaning, according to this Trotskyist author. In many respects, I think that term, does more harm than good, covers up more than it exposes. But certainly, the issue of wage differentials. Well, in Molotov, what's the name of the book in English? Molotov Remembers. I've only read the Russian view, but it's Molotov's memoirs, as dictated to Felix Chuyev over many years. Molotov says that. He says, we should be. Molotov didn't say we're not evolving towards socialism. He seemed to have thought that it was inevitable, that once you're on the road to socialism, you can't be knocked off. Of course, that's not true. But he said, but there's something wrong with the fact that these differences in pay, these differences in privileges are getting larger and larger and not smaller and smaller. And then there was a well-known economist during the Stalin and Khrushchev period who wrote some memoirs to be published after his death, where this is already in the 60s, where he says, I'm in despair because these differences between managers and the workers, between the these differences in pay and privileges and so forth and so on are getting larger instead of smaller, and I think that this is going to lead to very bad things, but it's going to lead to them after I'm dead. So please don't publish these memoirs until I'm dead. But again, I think that some of these developments were foreseen, and I think that that's the case. I think that if you get down to the essence of what, as I say, bureaucracy is just kind of like a blanket that covers everything up, and it doesn't really explain much. But if you get into the details of the developing inequalities in Soviet society and the economy and the party and so forth after the Stalin period, and then even during the Stalin period, then I think that explains a lot of why how it is that the Leninist view, if you want to call it that way, that Leninist view of how to build socialism was faulty. To the Soviets, Lenin, the Bolsheviks, broke with the Second International, but they didn't break sharply enough. Their concept of socialism did not break sharply enough with the Second International. And looking back on it, that was probably inevitable. So the onus is on us to learn from the successes of the Soviets, particularly under Stalin, and their errors, and to make sure that we imitate their successes and that we do not imitate their errors. That if we make errors, where everybody makes errors, a human society proceeds, human beings proceed by trial and error. We should make new and more creative errors and not repeat the same old errors that the Soviets committed.
Yeah, that was a really great answer. Thank you. And one thing I find very interesting is that I imagine a lot of your I say critics, a lot of the people who try and slander you would not have expected that, because of course to them you are just a Stalinist who defends everything the USSR ever did.
Yes, that's a very dishonest.
Exactly. It's completely not true. Clearly, because you just spoke at length about mistakes made. So yeah. All right.
Well,
Eric, did you have one more, or should we wrap it up here, Eric? What are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I have one more question that I think could be used for understanding period. And it's just like, I know that you personally, Professor Furr, have done lots of work talking about Stalin as a figure who pushed for democracy in the Soviet Union. And his position wasn't that of a dictator, that he was in favor of democratic reforms. And I was wondering, like, if you could bring to light what some of those reforms like entailed, how Soviet democracy, was envisioned by Stalin.
Well, this is back in 2005. I published this two-part article called "Stalin and the Struggle for Democratic Reform." I guess you're alluding to that article, and it's online. It's on my webpage. You can download it and read it. Anybody who's interested. The more I've thought about that since, the more I think that Stalin wanted to get the party out of running the country, out of running the economy, out of running the economy, out of running the government. He wanted to get the party back to recruiting, building the communist movement, recruiting communists, winning people to communism, winning people to Marxism. If you study the 1936 Constitution, you can see that. But his proposals as embodied in that constitution, looking back on it from our perspective today, seem to me to be social democratic. He wanted to have, contested elections. Perhaps that's too strong a term. Perhaps he wanted something along the lines of the Paris Commune, where representatives could be recalled at any time by their constituents. He certainly wanted to make sure that people voted for those they thought were the best, the best workers, whether they were members of the Communist Party or not. Stalin had some concept of that the party leadership especially had gone off the rails. In his concluding speech to the February-March 1937 Central Committee plenum, one of the things that Stalin called for was a set of schools in Marxism-Leninism, where party leaders on all levels would appoint a couple of replacements temporarily, and then go to Moscow for intensive training in Marxism-Leninism. Now you can go back and read it. There's a separate pamphlet published called "Mastering Bolshevism," which is part of Stalin's remarks in this speech, this concluding speech. And anyway, he said, "This is what we're going to do," and they never did it. It never happened. Stalin also said, well, of course, the 36th Constitution says that there are going to be contested elections in the Soviet Union for the Soviets, and the Soviets were to be, which means councils, were to be the real governing bodies of the Soviet Union, not the party. The party was not to govern the Soviet Union anymore. It wasn't to determine who was in the Soviets. It was just going to be, the party was just going to be campaigning for its own candidates to get elected. If they didn't get elected, that would show they weren't doing good work, and that would be a good thing for the party to learn. That never happened, and I write about that in that article, and also in my book Ussr versus Stalin. The Central Committee, which never spoke up against this plan, just did not support it. It was just a kind of strike, so that they never carried out that decision to have contested elections. They did carry it out. There's a very good book by Wendy Goldman, who puts everything in a kind of anti-Stalin framework, but it's a good book about workers in the Soviet Union at that time. There were contested elections in the trade unions. Stalin and company did not manage to get contested elections for the Soviets in 1937, which was their plan. Stalin had to withdraw his proposal. I discussed that in the article. But there were contested elections in the trade unions, and a large number of trade union officials were not elected. New people were elected, but there were never contested elections in the trade unions again after that. So there was a real struggle over that issue. Stalin considered it very important, and he didn't prevail, which is one of a great many pieces of evidence that Stalin was not a dictator, because who ever heard of a dictator being defeated when he tried to put forth his own plan?
Yeah, right. I think that's like a very solid answer. And I like that you framed it, as something that you've thought more critically about since then, about the more social democratic aspects of how Stalin viewed democracy. It's very interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think it's important. But of course, if you think that Stalin was a terrible dictator the whole time, you're never going to get to the point of looking at that question, and therefore you're never going to get to the point of thinking about it. And that's what all this anti-Stalinism does: is it cuts off. And that's it. The work that it does. It stops people from learning the important lessons that the history of the true history of the Soviet Union and the Stalin period has to teach us.
Yes, exactly. I think that was our last question, and from here we can Professor Furr, if you had anything else that you would like to say, if you would like to promote your works or give any special recommendations of your work, or just anywhere,
Sure.
any other plugs, that would be great.
Sure. There's a link on my homepage that lists all my books. Also, the books are on the homepage. My publisher has shifted over to publishing through Amazon now because Amazon features the books on the Amazon web pages. So you can now buy my books in most European countries and most countries in the Americas without paying the terrible shipping prices from the United States that it used to be necessary to pay. My articles are available for download. And I'd be glad to hear from any of you. But if you want to know more about the research I do, check out my homepage. I would say that's the thing to do. And I hope that some of you take seriously the task of carrying on this kind of work. I think it's very important work. You can learn Russian in a few years and start doing it. I encourage you anyway to embark on that road and go as far as you are able to do so.
The Marxist Literature Collective is an organization which aims to educate as wide of an audience as possible on socialism, anti-imperialism, and progressive issues using a Marxist framework. We do this through a combination of online content, the links for which can be found in the description below, and through action in our local communities. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for similar content. You can also find us on Patreon, where we offer exclusive content for patrons who help support the MLC.